The desert was supposed to be the graveyard of the infantry. In 1945, Bernard Montgomery's steel columns advanced with absolute certainty. They weren't just winning, they were inevitable. But by sunset, the invincible force of the Allied alliance was a field of burning wreckage, not from German shells, but from an ego that every expert, every general, and every designer had already dismissed as a joke. Weighing the heavy cost of 19,000 American lives, this obsolete relic of British imperial command was never supposed to pierce modern American resolve. It was awkward, it was painful to use, and it was hated by the men who carried the burden of its arrogance. Yet it did something the critics never anticipated. It didn't just fight the machines, it dismantled the system that kept the Western world running. Today, we look at how a failure of leadership became the hidden backbone of a desperate defense. Before we peel back the layers of this command crisis, we want to hear from you. Was Montgomery a misunderstood genius or a man whose ego nearly cost us the war? Tell us what you think of the story so far, and exactly where in the world you are watching from in the comments. If you truly value the history we uncover here, subscribe to WW2 War Notes right now. If you choose to ignore this and scroll past, please state your reasons below. We want to know why you're turning your back on the vault. The flashes of the bulbs were as blinding as the muzzle flares in the Ardennes. It was January 7th, 1945, in a damp room in Zonhoven, Belgium. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood before a pack of international reporters, his beret pulled tight, his chest puffed with the weight of 5 years of war. Outside, the world was still reeling from the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes meat grinder that had chewed through American divisions and left the Allied line screaming for air. Montgomery didn't just speak. He lectured. He described a scene of American chaos, a great mess that only a British professional could untangle. He told the world how he had stepped in to find American forces in disarray, how he had organized the defense, and how he, personally, had saved the Americans from total collapse. He made it sound like the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies were children who had lost their way in the woods, only to be guided home by the steady hand of the British Empire. The words didn't just drift through the smoke of the press room. They traveled like a shock wave across the Atlantic. In the foxholes of the Ardennes, the GIs who had just spent weeks freezing, bleeding, and watching their brothers die in the snow felt the sting. To them, this wasn't a strategic briefing. It was a second attack. This time, the fire was coming from behind their own lines. They had held the line at Bastogne and Saint-Vith with nothing but grit and M1 Garands, only to be told by a man in a clean uniform that they had panicked. The reaction at Supreme Headquarters, Shai-F, was volcanic. General Omar Bradley, the soldiers' general, was normally a man of quiet calculation, but when the reports reached him, his calm vanished. He saw the sacrifices of 19,000 Americans who never left those woods being traded for a headline. He didn't just want a retraction, he wanted blood. He told Eisenhower point blank he would resign his commission and head home before he spent another hour serving in a command structure that allowed such insults to be hurled at American soldiers. Eisenhower sat in the middle of this firestorm. He wasn't just looking at maps of the Rhine. He was watching the very foundation of the Western Alliance crack. On one side, he had the pompous British insistence that Montgomery was the only man capable of finishing the war. On the other, he had American generals threatening a mass walkout that would leave the Allied army leaderless on the doorstep of Germany. Montgomery's own chief of staff, Major General Freddy de Guingand, saw the writing on the wall. He flew to Eisenhower's headquarters and saw the relief orders already drafted. The invincible Montgomery was hours away from being fired, a move that would have shattered the alliance and potentially changed the outcome of the war. De Guingand rushed back to Montgomery with a terrifying truth. Write an apology, or you are finished. On January 8th, Montgomery signed the paper, not because he believed he was wrong, The ego of a field marshal is a fortress rarely breached, but because he realized the obsolete relic of his authority was about to be scrapped. The apology saved his job, but it did nothing to heal the wound. The trust was gone. And in the high-stakes game of coalition warfare, trust is the only currency that matters. By mid-January 1945, the Western Front was a map of jagged wounds and bleeding logistics. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, sat in his headquarters, a man caught between the grinding gears of two empires. The impossible task wasn't just defeating the Wehrmacht, it was managing the human machinery of his own command. Eisenhower faced a run-or-die scenario. If he couldn't stabilize the leadership, the American-led war effort would fracture before they ever touched the Rhine. The center of the storm was a massive tactical asset, the U.S. Ninth Army under General William Simpson. To a civilian, an army is a number on a page. To the generals, it was a protagonist object, a living, breathing force of 300,000 Americans that had become the ultimate bargaining chip. During the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, the German offensive had physically split the American lines. In a moment of operational necessity, Eisenhower had temporarily shifted the Ninth Army and the First Army under Montgomery's Northern Command. It was a logical move. Montgomery was closer to the action, his communications were intact, and he could provide the shield needed while Bradley regrouped in the South. It was a tool created to solve a problem under a ticking clock, but as the German threat receded, the solution became the new crisis. Montgomery didn't see a temporary arrangement. He saw a strategic evolution. He believed he had proven that when the amateur Americans got into trouble, they needed the professional British hand to guide them. He presented his case to Eisenhower with a cold, clinical certainty that ignored the political firestorm he had just ignited with his press conference. He demanded that the Ninth and First Armies remain under his command permanently for the great northern thrust into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart. The desperation in the room was palpable. British manpower was at its breaking point. After 5 years of blood, the British and Canadian units were exhausted, their reinforcements depleted. Montgomery saw the Ninth Army as his security blanket, 300,000 fresh American troops he needed to fuel his own vision of victory. Without them, the British 21st Army Group was a blunt instrument. With them, it was a world-ending force. But for the Americans, this was a classified nightmare. General Omar Bradley, the man who had commanded these forces since the beaches of Normandy, reached his limit. He watched Montgomery use American blood to build a British monument of glory. Bradley's position was firm. He would not serve as an army group commander without an army to command. He wouldn't watch from the sidelines as his men were used as colonial troops for a commander who didn't trust their methods and publicly insulted their courage. Eisenhower listened to Montgomery's formal presentation without interruption. Montgomery argued military logic. The Broadfront strategy was wasting resources. Everything, fuel, ammo, and men, should be concentrated in the North under a single, unified commander. Him. He argued that taking these armies away now would doom the final offensive and prolong the war. It was a terrifying threat. If Eisenhower refused, he risked a sluggish end to the conflict. If he agreed, he lost his American generals. George Patton, hearing of the demand, didn't just offer his resignation. He promised a revolution. Patton's Third Army had just performed the impossible, turning 90 degrees in a blizzard to save the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. For Patton, the idea of being chained up by a man he viewed as an incompetent egomaniac was the final straw. Eisenhower was trapped in a room with no oxygen. He had to decide: keep Montgomery happy and lose the loyalty of the American command structure, or restore the American armies and risk the wrath of London. The weight of the decision was a physical burden, a bruising pressure that left no room for error. The alliance was a machine held together by duct tape and high-octane ego, and it was about to redline. To understand why the alliance almost buckled, You have to look at the technical wall Eisenhower was hitting. The manual, the sacred Broadfront doctrine, dictated that the Allied line should advance equally to deny the enemy a chance to counterattack. But Montgomery called this worthless, a strategic failure of engineering. He wanted a single, narrow, high-velocity thrust. In his mind, the American method was messy, wasteful, and amateurish. The protagonist object of this friction was the spec sheet of the Ninth Army. Under General Simpson, the Ninth was a masterpiece of American organization, 300,000 men, thousands of Sherman tanks, and a logistical tail that could move mountains. But to Montgomery, they were a tool he didn't trust the Americans to use correctly. He viewed the American command style, flexible, rapid, and aggressive, as a failure of discipline. The experts in London agreed. British planners whispered that the Americans lacked the professionalism for a set-piece battle like the crossing of the Rhine. The human cost of this technical disagreement was a physical and emotional toll that felt like a bruise on the shoulder of every American officer. For General Simpson and his Ninth Army staff, being under Montgomery felt less like a partnership and more like being held hostage. They were treated as a security blanket for a British force that was physically exhausted after 5 years of war. The British 21st Army Group was running out of men. Their divisions were under strength, their equipment worn thin. They needed American steel to bridge the gap, but they refused to acknowledge the builders of that steel as equals. The midpoint twist came when Montgomery pushed his luck. He presented his strategic authority plan, essentially asking to be the supreme ground commander for the rest of the war. He used math and physics to argue that the Americans in the South were making limited progress and that resources should be diverted from Patton's Third Army to fuel his own northern thrust. We are now at the absolute peak of the crisis, where the egos of the high command threaten to let the Third Reich catch its breath. If you're finding this story into the vault of history valuable, hit that subscribe button for WW2 War Notes right now. If you're walking away and leaving the Alliance behind, we need to know why. Leave your reason in the comments. Don't let history be forgotten just because it's uncomfortable. The irony was a jagged pill for the Americans to swallow. Patton had been starved of fuel back in September to prop up Montgomery's Operation Market Garden, a plan that was a 90% successful failure. Now, Montgomery was asking to steal those resources again. The recoil of this demand was felt all the way in Washington. Eisenhower finally saw the technical wall for what it was, a move for personal glory disguised as military logic. He realized that if he gave Montgomery what he wanted, he wouldn't just be giving him an army. He would be dismantling the American command structure. Bradley had already packed his bags. Patton was ready to walk. The failure here wasn't the American soldier. It was the British Field Marshal's inability to see that the world had changed since 1939. Montgomery's staff talked about operations beyond the Rhine, as if the Ninth Army was a permanent fixture of the British crown. They ignored the tactical shift. They didn't realize that the amateur Americans were about to prove that their mobile, so opportunistic warfare could achieve in hours what Montgomery's meticulous planning took weeks to prepare. The experts had dismissed the American method as a joke, but as the winter of 1945 turned to spring, the obsolete American doctrine was about to dismantle the system that kept Montgomery's ego running. The stalemate broke not in a boardroom, but through a middle path brokered by Winston Churchill. The Prime Minister realized what Montgomery could not. The American giant had fully awakened, and the British Empire was now the junior partner. Churchill's compromise was the tactical shift Eisenhower needed. Return the First Army to Bradley immediately, but let Montgomery keep the Ninth Army for one specific mission: Operation Plunder, the crossing of the Rhine. This was the aha moment. Eisenhower accepted, but with a restriction that acted as a strategic gauntlet. Montgomery could keep the Ninth, but only temporarily. Once the Rhine was crossed, the army would return to American command. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a deadline for Montgomery's relevance. Montgomery accepted the terms, convinced that once the operation began, he could argue for operational necessity to keep the Americans indefinitely. He went back to his maps, planning the most elaborate river crossing in the history of warfare. He demanded 300,000 troops, massive artillery bombardments, and 2 airborne divisions. It was a set-piece masterpiece where nothing was left to chance. Every shell was counted, every bridgehead was pre-planned. But while Montgomery was measuring the diameter of his artillery shells, George Patton was looking at the river. On March 22, 1945, near Oppenheim, Patton's Third Army reached the Rhine. There was no massive bombardment. There were no paratroopers. Patton saw a weakly defended section of the river and, in a demonstration of American mobile warfare in its purest form, he simply crossed it. "Tell the world we're across," Patton barked at Bradley. "I want the world to know Third Army made it before Monty starts his engines." It was a validation that shattered the British expert disdain. Patton had crossed the Rhine with fewer casualties and 0 preparation, proving that the American method wasn't a failure. It was the future. When Operation Plunder finally launched on March 23rd, it was indeed impressive. But the warrior had already beaten the politician by 24 hours. The Ninth Army performed excellently under Montgomery's direction during the crossing. They were the southern prong of the attack, seized key positions, and established a massive bridgehead. Montgomery praised them, not out of sudden respect, but as a setup for his next move. As the smoke cleared on March 25th, Montgomery's staff began submitting plans for an advance into northern Germany that included the Ninth Army as a permanent fixture. We are witnessing the final gasps of an old-world command style being overtaken by the raw speed of the American war machine. If you want to see the moment the tide of history officially turned, you need to be subscribed to W2 War Notes. If you're choosing to leave us now, tell us why in the comments. Are you siding with the methodical planners or the daring exploiters? Eisenhower saw the move coming. Montgomery argued that removing the Ninth Army now would be militarily foolish and would disrupt the encirclement of the Ruhr. It was the same technical argument he had used for months, but this time Eisenhower had the smoking gun. Patton's rapid success had proven that the Ninth Army didn't need Montgomery's slow, methodical leadership to win. The protagonist object, the American soldier, was faster than the system Montgomery had tried to build around him. The validation was complete. American methods worked, American generals were competent, and the Ninth Army was going home. On April 4th, Eisenhower issued the final order. The Ninth Army was officially returned to Bradley's 12th Army Group. The experiment of British command over American steel was over. The return of the Ninth Army to American control on April 4th, 1945, was more than a logistical transfer. It was the final, silent collapse of a world order that had dictated military thought for centuries. Eisenhower's decision to finally strip Montgomery of his American security blanket was the culmination of a strategic gauntlet that the Field Marshal had walked since January. By letting Montgomery keep one army temporarily, Eisenhower hadn't just been making a political concession. He had been conducting a live-fire experiment in command styles. The result was a jagged, undeniable truth that echoed from the halls of Chef, down to the mud-clogged foxholes of the front. Coalition warfare requires trust, and ego is the ultimate friction that grinds the gears of victory to a halt. For Montgomery, the Ninth Army was the protagonist object he believed he needed to secure his place in history. He viewed the 300,000 Americans under General Simpson not as partners, but as a technical resource to be managed, a fuel source for his great northern thrust. His philosophy was one of set-piece dominance, a belief that war could be engineered into a predictable mechanical process if only one man had absolute strategic authority. But as the winter snows of the Ardennes melted into the spring mud of the Rhineland, That philosophy hit a technical wall. The American command style, flexible, decentralized, and violently aggressive, had proven that it didn't need a British architect. The irony was a bitter pill that Montgomery's staff at the 21st Army Group found impossible to swallow. In the months leading up to the Rhine crossing, they had treated the Ninth Army as a permanent fixture, planning operations deep into the heart of Germany, as if the American flag had been replaced by the Union Jack. They ignored the tactical shift happening in the South. They ignored the fact that while they were meticulously counting artillery shells and preparing elaborate airborne drops for Operation Plunder, George Patton was proving the rules of the Rhine were obsolete. Patton's opportunistic crossing at Oppenheim had been a demonstration of American mobile warfare in its purest form, a failure of formal planning that somehow achieved a strategic miracle. The lesson was clear. In the high-stakes reality of 1945, there was only what worked and what did not. Montgomery's methodical approach worked, but it was slow, expensive, and required an arrogance that the alliance could no longer afford. The expert disdain that Montgomery and his planners held for the amateur Americans had backfired. By treating the Ninth Army as his personal security blanket, Montgomery had inadvertently highlighted his own limitations. He had become a man fighting a 1914 war of attrition in a 1945 world of mechanized speed. The human cost of this philosophical divide was felt most sharply by the commanders like Bradley and Simpson. For them, every day spent under Montgomery's command felt like being held hostage by a man who didn't trust their methods. The bruise on the shoulder was the constant feeling of being undervalued when Eisenhower finally issued the order for the Ninth Army to return to the 12th Army Group. It wasn't just a memo. It was a liberation. For the GIs, it meant they were no longer colonial troops for a foreign field marshal. They were back with their own, moving at their own pace and rewriting the manual of war as they went. Montgomery's reaction to losing the Ninth Army was one of icy protest. He appealed to Churchill, arguing that removing the Americans would doom the northern offensive and disrupt the encirclement of the Ruhr. He used math and logistical physics to claim that unity of command was being sacrificed for political reasons. But Eisenhower saw through the technical jargon. He realized that Montgomery was using operational necessity as a shield for his own ego. The gamble of giving Montgomery one last chance with the Ninth Army had paid off, not because Montgomery had changed, but because he hadn't. He had proven that even with American strength, he couldn't match the raw velocity of the American Broadfront advance. We are watching the sunset of the British Imperial Command and the dawn of the American superpower. This isn't just a story about generals, it's a story about the death of an old world. If you want to witness the final reckoning where the invincible Montgomery is left behind by history, you must be subscribed to WW2 War Notes. If you're choosing to walk away now, you're missing the final truth of the alliance. Tell us why in the comments. Are you afraid of what happens when the heroes of the past turn out to be humans with flaws? The aha moment of this chapter is the realization that the alliance survived not because the leaders liked each other, but because the system was designed to survive the failures of its individual components. Eisenhower's cynical professionalism saved the war. He let Montgomery hang himself with his own demands, giving him enough rope, in the form of the Ninth Army, to prove his methods were no longer the inevitable path to victory. By early April, the Ninth Army was surging toward the Elbe under Bradley's direction, achieving in days what Montgomery's staff had projected would take weeks. The protagonist object, the American war machine, was finally unshackled. The philosophical struggle was over. The war would be finished on American terms, with American speed, under American command. Montgomery was left in the north, commanding only his Commonwealth forces, a field marshal whose vision of a grand Allied thrust to Berlin had died not in a German ambush, but in the friction of his own arrogance. The war did not end for Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery with the thunderous applause he had envisioned in the press rooms of Belgium. It ended with the quiet, rhythmic hum of thousands of American GMC trucks driving east, away from his headquarters. On April 4, 1945, the Ninth Army officially reverted to General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. For Montgomery, this wasn't just a personnel transfer. It was a seismic shift in the tectonic plates of global power. The protagonist object of this final act wasn't a weapon of steel, but the alliance itself, a fragile machine that had been tested to its absolute breaking point by the very man who claimed to be its most professional engineer. As General William Simpson's 300,000 Americans packed their gear and moved toward the Elbe River, they did so with a speed and autonomy that rendered Montgomery's meticulous planning obsolete. In the days following the transfer, the Ninth Army covered ground with a velocity that shocked the British staff. They weren't waiting for massive artillery bombardments or 90% successful failures. They were exploiting German collapses with a run-or-die ferocity that the American command structure had perfected in the wake of the Ardennes. The great failure of Montgomery's career wasn't a lost battle. It was a lost trust. The obsolete relic of his command authority had been dismantled not by the Wehrmacht, but by his own refusal to acknowledge that the world had changed since he was the hero of El Alamein. In the high-stakes environment of 1945, the British Empire was exhausted. Their units were under strength, their manpower reserves were dry, and their influence was waning. Montgomery had tried to use the Ninth Army as a security blanket to mask this decline, attempting to lead a massive Allied thrust to Berlin fueled by American blood. He wanted the glory of the finish line, but he lacked the horses to get there. The aha moment for history came when the Ninth Army reached the Elbe. Under Bradley's direction, the Americans achieved in a matter of days what Montgomery's staff had predicted would take weeks of set-piece preparation. The smoking gun of Montgomery's strategic irrelevance was the meeting at the Elbe. When American and Soviet troops shook hands, the world saw a map that Montgomery had tried to prevent. He had argued that without his unified command, the Allied advance would be a great mess. Instead, it was a masterpiece of American mobile warfare. But the most humiliating validation of this shift occurred in London. Forced to repair the structural damage caused by Montgomery's ego, Winston Churchill had to stand before the House of Commons and swallow a bitter pill of national pride. He publicly admitted that the British Empire was now the junior partner, declaring that American troops had done almost all the fighting and have suffered almost all the losses. It was a moment of political submission that echoed through the decades, highlighting that the era of British strategic dominance had ended in a hotel room in Belgium, where a field marshal couldn't stop talking about himself. Montgomery was left to accept the surrender of German forces in the northern plains, the Netherlands, and Denmark. It was a professional victory, but a lonely one. He was commanding only Commonwealth forces. His dream of being the supreme ground commander who rode into Berlin was dead. It had died in January when Eisenhower realized that he couldn't keep both Montgomery happy and his American generals loyal. Eisenhower had chosen the human anchor, the loyalty of the men who did the fighting over the expert who did the talking. The takeaway from this lonely battle is a punchy, universal truth. In the theater of war, your technical brilliance doesn't matter if your ego destroys the machine you're meant to drive. Montgomery had focused on the specs, the math, and the physics of the narrow thrust, but he ignored the chemistry of the alliance. Eisenhower, the voice of history, understood that trust is the only fuel that doesn't run out. He gave Montgomery enough rope to hang himself, and the field marshal used every inch of it, proving that even with the best tools in the world, a commander who doesn't trust his men will eventually be left behind by them. You've just witnessed the final, grinding end of a command crisis that nearly handed the war back to the Reich. If you believe that history belongs to those who do the work, not just those who take the credit, then you belong in the WW2 war notes. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you never miss another World War II story of the hidden machinery of the world's greatest conflict. If you're choosing to walk away now, please leave a comment explaining why. Did we cut too close to the truth for you? But for those who stay, the vault is just getting started. Our next file is truly mouth-watering. We're investigating the Project Z blueprints, the secret Japanese plan for a 6-engine superbomber designed to reach the American mainland, and the forgotten American radar tech that was the only thing standing in its way. You think you know how the war ended? Think again, lest I forget the Ninth Army's role in the final victory was played out under the American flag, using American methods led by American generals. The lesson was etched into the soil of Germany. The alliance was not a tool for personal glory. It was a desperate, beautiful, and chaotic necessity. And when the final gun fell silent on May 8th, the world didn't remember the Field Marshal's press conference. They remembered the GIs who had survived the Ardennes meat grinder and finished the job their way. We'll see you in the next story.